Far be it from an Englishman to agree with a Frenchman, but Emmanuel Macron has been caught calling Boris Johnson a clown in charge of a circus, according to French media. It's not exactly the most dignified look for the French president, who has previously attempted to, as the Guardian reported here, take the sort of high-minded line in negotiations with Britain over, for instance, the Channel crisis. Here he is, as the Guardian reports, complaining that Boris Johnson's letter offering to collaborate over solving the migrant crisis was sent publicly via tweet. We do not communicate on these issues via tweets, he said of this. Wasn't very happy, but then is now and again. Also, the French have been doing diplomacy by tweet for a very long time. Most of their government ministers have had something disobliging to say about the British in the last few months. So it's sort of typical Macron grandstanding. It is the small man complex. He looks big, or he tries to make himself look big.
Well, it's the Napoleon complex in his instance.
Yeah, it conceals an incredibly small penis. But nevertheless, here he is calling Boris Johnson a clown in charge of a circus. I don't like having to agree with him, but Boris does give that impression. As the Telegraph here reports, he's privately branded Boris Johnson a clown, although he made sure it got out. The French president reportedly claimed to aides that the UK Prime Minister admitted to him that he has to cater to his public opinion by creating phony wars against the French to mask difficulties supposedly caused by Brexit, which is, again, massive. The problem with this is that I hate both of them, and they're both completely wrong. Because there is no phony war, for instance, over the Channel migrants, because the French are actively stoking a war over the Channel migrants by deliberately not stopping them, which is why the letter was sent by a tweet anyway, because all previous letters that had been sent privately led to nothing, and some weren't even responded to. So the attempt was made by Boris Johnson and the Conservative government to publicly pressure Macron by releasing the letter via tweet at the same time, to which Macron objected baselessly. But he is probably right to call Boris a clown. So yeah, I can't do French pronunciation. How does that go? Le canard enchaîné?
Le canard enchaîné, I think.
Foreign. A satirical and investigative French weekly cited Mr. Macron making the disparaging remarks during a trip to the Croatian capital last Wednesday, just hours after 27 migrants drowned when their inflatable boat sank mid-channel. They wouldn't have drowned if the French had done their job. The two leaders spoke by phone in the wake of the tragedy, but attempted cooperation swiftly descended into a row over Britain publishing a letter from Mr. Johnson to Mr. Macron setting out the proposals to tackle small boat crossings. The Telegraph continues that according to Le Canard, after the call, an infuriated Mr. Macron went on to tell a small group of advisors in Zagreb, Bojo talks to me. He's down to earth, everything's fine, we're having grown-up discussions, and then he sticks it to us either beforehand or afterwards in an ill-elegant manner. It's always the same circus. The French don't mind sticking it to anybody, but they're at least elegant while they do it. At least they pretend to be.
But I don't think Boris Johnson could ever be accused of elegance.
No, that is one word I don't think I've ever seen in the same sentence as his name in any publication or anything ever written about him.
It would be like describing a hippo as balletic.
Even that is probably closer. I mean, like, you've seen hippos underwater. I don't think Boris Johnson improves if he becomes sort of subaqueous.
Submerged in excrement.
I sometimes do wish he would go to the bottom of a lake, though. But on Wednesday, the Telegraph continues British government insiders adopted a diplomatic posture in the face of the provocative remarks, venturing only that Mr. Macron appeared to be playing to a domestic French audience ahead of the upcoming presidential ballot in April, onto which we shall shortly come, and he is, because he's not doing massive. He will almost certainly win, but he's never been as secure as he thinks he has a right to be. And given he swept to power on his wave of optimism, he created a political party and named it after his own damn initials, En Marche, subsequently the Republic En Marche, which was then wiped out at the first elections. But the first time the French had a chance to give their opinion on how his government was performing, they just completely obliterated Emmanuel Macron's party and left him in charge, only because the French, being the French, couldn't think of anyone better than Marine Le Pen to run against him. There is now potentially somebody better to run against him, onto whom we shall come very shortly. But a senior government source told the Telegraph the Prime Minister continues to be a staunch and public advocate for the strength of the UK-French relationship. Our approach will not change, even if we have to wait until the other side of the French presidential election for a change of tone. And it is quite blatant, obvious political posturing by Macron. He does that. This is his sole form of governing. It's just posture. It's posture politic. That's all it is. It's grandstanding. It's big gestures and no substance.
Well, he should like Boris Johnson then.
He should. But no, I mean, Boris is slightly more popular than Macron is. And that really is saying something, given that Boris is not particularly popular. But the French don't do elections well. The reason he's in power is because in the first round of the French presidential elections, there's usually quite a few candidates from a number of different parties, and that's when the French vote for who they want to vote for. But then they're progressively knocked out by vote tally. And then the second round is the two people who have sort of got they're the best of the losers, effectively, from the first round. And in the second round, which is the one that actually decides French presidential elections, the French only vote against the person they don't like, not for the person they actually want. Which is why Macron gets in, despite not very many French people actually liking or believing in him, solely because they didn't dislike him as much as they disliked Marine Le Pen, which is understandable because Marine Le Pen is awful.
So the French electoral system runs on dissatisfaction.
It's as deeply broken and dysfunctional as the rest of the French state is. Yes.
The vast French state, which has something like 70% of its citizens working for it, or something like this.
Yeah, and Anglophobia plays well to a certain base in France, which is the sort of it's the very bitter base in France that has never been it sort of snootily dismisses what it calls sort of Anglo-Saxon ways of doing things, because it's never come to terms with the fact that a tiny island off of its coast is much more successful than it is or ever will be, because our system of government is better and our rights are better and our approach to the philosophy of governance is better. So the French have dramatic because they're French, it must be dramatic penis envy. Also because they're French, it must be penis envy. So
Yes, well, if you've had like one revolutions and however many republics in 200 years, and you look across the channel and you see a unitary government that's existed in more or less its current form since the 1600s, I can imagine you'd be a bit, not
jealous.
well, maybe, or just annoyed.
Yeah, annoyed is one way of putting it, but it's sort of like writers. Who was it? Was it Gore Vidal who said that or something along the lines of every time he sees a friend of his succeed, a little bit of him dies.
Yeah, that was Vidal.
I
Or
think that was
if it
Vidal.
was, it could have been because Vidal was very much of that
Yeah,
nature.
but also quite a French, certainly a continental mindset. But then the French are just deeply, deeply dysfunctional people with a deeply, deeply dysfunctional country. So it pays for Macron to mouth off against Britain occasionally, just because they need to. It's displacement of blame. It's what all people who are fundamentally guilty have to do. But
Well,
the French,
they've got the. I mean, if we're going through an identity crisis of our own, as I suppose most Western countries are at the moment, the French have the added difficulty of having that sort of bifurcation actually sort of written into their recent history and their constitution, because you know, you've got the classic, albeit rather rough and inadequate, distinction between old Catholic France and new, very secular, aggressively secular, sort of atheistic, uh, encyclopédie France. Or
no, that's
the,
all. That's
you've
always
got
been
the
a
France of
deficient
you've got
caricature.
no, of course, I said it was, but it is nevertheless there, and you can see it in you can see it when you go there.
No, it's just all these people who seem to think that France is some deeply secular country and the Catholics are some kind of tiny and battled minority. Just okay, well, the French are quite happy to ban burqas, but look at the reaction when they try and ban nuns' habits. So the French have always been a deeply Catholic people,
Oh no, but
with an
that's
officially
my point. I mean,
militantly. Well, this is
The
testament
Catholics are much stronger in France than most people tend to think. But
massively.
it is nevertheless the case that eh, any Catholic living in France is living in a constitutionally anti-Catholic country.
No, because the Constitution in practice has nothing to say about Catholicism. It doesn't very much mind. The Constitution doesn't prohibit huge amounts of money being poured in to rebuild Notre Dame, for instance. It doesn't try and impose equal bans on attire. It doesn't say, well, if you're banning the burqa, you must therefore ban nuns' habits. It doesn't say, well, because we're stopping Islamic expression of religion, we must also stop people from wearing crucifixes. It always tacitly takes the side of the Catholic majority because that's what
Sure,
most
but
of these countries do.
they nevertheless have in their recent history, very recent history, um, attempts to sort of out outright ban and kill clerics. All of this stuff.
Not by the state, by another embattled religious minority, although a much more assertive
No,
one.
no, by the state. I mean, I don't have the data to hand, but no, I mean the French Revolution inaugurated into the early 20th century, I
Oh,
believe.
if we're going back to the French Revolution, then yes, it wasn't very kind to the clerisy of its day. I thought you said modern history though, so
Well,
But
I would class the 18th century as modern history.
yeah, I think a bit has changed since then. But
Certainly, certainly.
that's a very long historical
Yes, that's by the
rabbit
by.
hole
Do
by which we
excuse
could go
me.
down. But no, it's just testament to the French nature that they import an American style revolution and cock that up, and then they import secularism and do that wrong as well. They import trade unions and do that terribly wrong. Um, it's just a deeply dysfunctional country. But Macron has, and it's revealed here. So as Macron says, the Telegraph continues, that Boris, he says, positions himself as a victim. He makes France a scapegoat. He tries to turn every simplistic situation into a complex problem. This pot kettle black. We've been in this situation since March. He's done this on the sausage war, on fishing. We haven't impounded any French boats. The French have impounded ours. And on the submarine affair, in which is again, he's incredibly bitter. So much salt, enough salt to fill the oceans in which his useless submarines will be sailing, but not to Australia. About the jettisoned submarine deal. This is nothing to do with Boris making simple situations complicated. It's because actually Australia has more in common with the rest of the Anglosphere than it does with France, and the Anglosphere is better for Australia and has better technology and better military technology than the French do. So get stuff, Macron. That he continues in private. He says he's sorry to act this way, but he admits that above all, he must cater to his public opinion, which is ironic, but also true. So doubly ironic, because Boris has been in the past been, I think he has admitted to someone. There was a Spectator cartoonist, I think, when Boris was editor there. And Boris would not give him the lead story, so he didn't know what cartoon he was supposed to be drawing at any point. And he kept asking for Boris to tell him, and he just wouldn't do it until the night before when he called him up and just demanded to speak to Boris himself. Boris did his usual blustery thing. And the cartoonist said, look, you can cut this Woodhouseian crap. It's not going to rub with me. And Boris apparently said, I think you'll find this Woodhouseian crap, as you put it, has served me very well. Which, well, it's sort of
that sends chills up my spine whenever I hear that. How it goes.
It does a little bit, but yeah. So Macron is being salty. There is a man who might replace him, who's more interesting than him, and who the Guardian doesn't like. So automatically, I'm inclined in his direction, which is Eric Zemmour, the supposed, well, as the Guardian would classify him, a far right media pundit.
Yeah, well, I don't know what to believe about him thus far because I literally heard of him about 3 days ago. So if he is very, very far to the right, then obviously I don't like him.
Well, I've seen a few of the things that he's said, and some of them are definitely on the right, but I haven't seen a huge amount. There's one in particular about Marshal Pétain, of whom he's a pseudo defender, Marshal Pétain, which is that's the dodgiest thing I've heard him say. The rest of it, some of it,
yeah,
just
well,
sounds
that's pretty indicative, though.
Well, but on the grounds, he said that actually Marshal Pétain rescued Jews rather than handed them over. So it might be a misreading of history. It's not one of those things that he doesn't like him because he killed Jews. He likes him because he said he tried to save them, which is okay. Maybe that's well intentioned, but fundamentally wrong. The other things I've heard him say, yeah, a lot of them are on the right. A lot of them, though, are the kind of thing that only the Guardian and the New Statesman would call far right and toxic, which actually, as the Guardian has here to acknowledge, has much more mainstream support. So this is the Guardian's Didier Fassin. I do not need to register for the Guardian. Go away. Not paying for this crap. Right. So as Didier Fassin, I'm going to keep forgetting that name. You have to remember this for me because I will forget it. So yeah,
it sounds like a footballer.
Brand Zemmour, a far right journalist and polemicist, mentions, of course, that he's been on trial on charges of incitement to racial hatred. That trial, from what I know of it, is baseless. And the French judicial system has a long and sordid history of politically motivated trials. I mean, they put, what's his name? Incredibly milquetoast former head of the Republican Party, replaced by Barnier.
I was going to mention Dreyfus, but
well, that's one. That's one pretty bad example. Oh no, I can't remember his name. He ran against Macron as the Republicans' candidate, but there was a really suspiciously well-timed corruption investigation, which always seems to come about when the favoured man of the French establishment is facing any kind of electoral threat. His name will probably come back to me in an inconvenient moment. But anyway, so the fact that he's been put on trial is not of itself a bad thing, and if the trial has not actually found in any direction yet, because he's denying the charges. He says they're unfounded. The verdict isn't expected until next year anyway. I think it depends. If he's up in the polls, they'll find him guilty. If he's no threat to Macron, they'll find him innocent. That's usually how the French legal system works, because it's another example of the way the French state is massively incompetent. It doesn't have a functioning legal system in any sane definition of the term. But he's previously been convicted, The Guardian continues, of incitement to racial hatred and religious hatred. He's been tried and acquitted in several other cases. Don't know the word acquitted. But the stakes are different this time. The defendant is now a candidate for president. In November, polls indicated he's up to 17% of the electorate would choose him to be the next president, which is behind only Emmanuel Macron. He's been leeching support off of Marine Le Pen. Someone finally who is competent and can string a sentence together has risen up and overtaken her in the polls. National Front still has, or what they rebranded, the Rassemblement National or something. So that they are still in the. If they were to drop out, Zemmour could actually win in the first round. I think they've still got sufficient support behind them to really bump that up above 35. But that's where he's getting a lot. But he's also getting a lot of. I don't think the Guardian will mention this. He's getting quite a lot of support from sort of disenfranchised working class France as well, which again is a defining feature of the old National Front, is that it didn't actually neatly map up to left right in the way that people like the Guardian would like to say that it did. They always said that it's massively far right, but it took a huge amount of supporters from disenfranchised voters who used to go for the Socialist Party. So 17%, as the article points out, would choose him apparently at the moment, which is behind only Macron, suggesting that in the second round of the election, it could be between the two of them. And that would be good, because Zemmour can actually, he's quite witty, and he's sort of like Tucker Carlson, I suppose, but actually intelligent, so more lethal. He would give Macron, to use a horrible phrase, a run for his money. But yeah, The Guardian continues, the rise of Zemmour, born to Algerian Jewish parents and raised in the, I can't pronounce that word either, banlieue?
Banlieue, but I used to know why.
The equivalent of the
banlieue, I think.
banlieue, the equivalent of the shittiest inner city parts of London, basically. The bits that are really Islamized. He's a media phenomenon. He's spent most of his professional life in newspapers and television, where he's been able to exercise his vitriolic style and make reactionary arguments. He's thought crime from The Guardian. Second, he's benefited from extraordinary media coverage of his scandalous statements. Not only was he on the cover of conservative magazine, Go, Valeur Actuelle.
Where's this?
First paragraph, conservative magazine Valeurs Actuelles.
Yeah, Valeur Actuelle.
Cool. 5 times in the first 9 months of 2021. But according to Media Observatory Acrimed, he was mentioned 4,167 times in all French outlets. And there's analogies with Trump here, as well. The guy's just coming on to explain this, but Trump got billions of dollars worth of free airtime, not from Fox News, which is always credited with winning him the election, but from CNN, MSNBC. So, and he used deliberately provocative statements to get that airtime. So there are analogies there. But
apparently he's an essayist as well.
You know, he is. Yeah, he's a historian, essayist, writer. As the Guardian says here, while Trump traded on vulgarity, was unconvincing when bragging about his IQ. Zemmour is an intellectual who studied the elite University of Sciences, Po, even if he failed the entrance exam to the National School of Administration, which is the one that really runs France. Everyone comes from Lena. It's if people think that the number of Eton graduates in a Conservative Party government is bad, look at the French, because everyone comes from the same school. And his rhetoric goes beyond Trump, apparently. So I thought this would be interesting to read, in part because you'll have to note, A, the number of things The Guardian says that he said, and B, the number of things they've actually linked to him saying. Because I don't trust The Guardian to be reporting these things honestly if they're not actually linking to him saying these things. Because they almost are certainly taken wildly out of context.
There's always a way to report them, and there's always a way that they can be said reasonably in the original instance. I mean, I see here that in one of the paragraphs here, he says that political power should belong to men, and that women's role should be to have and raise children. Well, those are the Guardian's words, and they're not linked. And what he could have said was that biologically speaking, if he did indeed say that only political power should belong to men, then obviously I disagree with him. But what he might well have said, and the Guardian hasn't said that he said, is that biologically speaking, men for 500,000 years have had a providing role, and that feminism's admirable drive to give women equal rights hasn't led to uniformly good consequences for women. I mean, the argument's often made now with increasing boldness that all it's done really is give the women right to be equal right to become wage slaves for faceless corporations. I mean, all of this can be conditioned. All of this can be put in all manner of ways, and I
Yeah,
don't
it's the
trust the
so
way
what
that
you're
the Guardian
saying.
has put it.
It's the so what you're saying is thing. Is Jordan Peterson says something. Kathy Newman assumes he's saying that women should be tied to the kitchen, which is not in fact what he said.
Yeah,
Though
well, Kathy
it's
Newman
superficially
ought
related to
not
it.
to be tied to a news desk, wherever she's tied.
But she's probably one of the Guardian's 5 readers, so she is the kind of person who will actually read this stuff. It's her kind of mindset that they go into. But let's go anyway. The Guardian says that this is one that they have linked to. He said that parents should only be allowed to give their children traditional French names. Very
Yeah,
far right, that proposition.
well, no, that does seem to be. I wouldn't go in for that at
No,
all.
no,
I
I
mean,
think that's dumb, but
the
it's not
state
far
choose.
right. Oh, hold on, I've lost you.
Far right in principle. I mean, a far left
Pause.
stick.
I can't hear you. You've gone robotic. Say that again.
Can you hear me now?
I can now. Yeah.
Yeah,
Restart that sentence.
it's not intrinsically a right-wing proposition. It could just as well be said by a left-wing government, but it is nativistic, I think, and I don't like the idea of the government.
Lost you.
I don't like the idea of the government. You can name your children.
No, neither do I. But I don't. But I'm not sure that's well. They have linked to it. We could go through each one of these linked to. Unless if he says that the government mandates what French people are allowed to call their children, then I think that's dumb. I think it's silly. I don't think it's dangerous. I don't think it's far right. I think it is definite. It probably is right wing. I can't imagine a left wing person saying that, but it's not toxically far right. Moving on, he approvingly referred to people comparing Nazism with Islam, which I don't really object to, given that the Nazis made common cause with, for instance, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem during the war. And it's one thing, and Islam propagates some incredibly nasty ideologies, which the Nazis would have blushed at. So if you were saying all Muslims are Nazis, I would completely disagree with that. That would be toxic and far right. But if he's simply saying that there is an ideological similarity between Nazism and Islam, I think that's a tenable proposition. It's one on which we could disagree. It's one on which you could have an academic debate.
Oh,
But
well, extremist Islamism is definitely comparable to fascism. Definitely.
yeah, I mean, and to the extent it does actually advocate political systems, and those political systems are pretty objectively fascistic, if not fascist.
Mm.
Nazis and well, we've seen a video only today of the group of Muslim men on Oxford Circus surrounding a bus full of Jewish children and doing the Nazi salute. This is an attitude that's not uncommon amongst Muslim majority countries. If you read look at the cartoons in the magazines in Egypt, for instance, from Egypt to Saudi Arabia to Iran, they have some. There are comparisons to be made. Unfortunately, moderate Islam, I'm sort of I'm in favor of it only insofar as it's better than radical fundamentalist Islam. I think I'd prefer that people just weren't religious of any description, but nevertheless, I think this is a tenable point, not just toxic far right racism. One they don't link. He propagated the so-called Great Replacement theory. There are wackos who propagate that theory, but also demography points out that this is in fact kind of what happens. So wackos who go in for the Great Replacement theory say that it's all deliberate plan of some sinister new world order, and that's bullshit because no government is that competent and has that many ideas about anything. That's obviously nonsense. But as The Strange Death of Europe shows, Douglas Murray's book, this is the natural tendency. If demographic trends are not changed or reversed or halted, that's the effect, whether it's intended or not. So they haven't linked to it, so it's impossible for us to say which version of that he's gone in for.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I'm not again inclined to take their word for it. He's argued that employers have a right to turn down black or Arab candidates. It's an old argument which we've had in this country. We had it around Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. Again, it's usually misinterpreted. Like if you object to laws which mandate racial considerations with hiring, for instance, or you say that you're not allowed to turn down some races as much as you turn down others without being called a racist, which is the inevitable result of these kinds of laws, then that's a bad thing. If he's saying that employers can turn down people because they are black, I don't agree with that. But also, I don't think that government action to stop it has ever succeeded anywhere in the world. So there is that. And again, they haven't linked to that, so it's impossible to say in what sense he meant it.
Well, it's also economically stupid, as Thomas Sowell has pointed out in a number of his books, an actually genuinely racist employer who is avoiding qualified black people, for example, in favor of unqualified white people, will go out of business or will be outcompeted eventually. So
Oh yeah,
economics, the free markets, not that France has a free market, tends
that's
to weed
partly
this
the
kind of
problem.
yeah, it tends to weed this kind of nonsense out. But
Yeah.
obviously,
Walter
employers who don't pick people on the basis of their skin color are scumbags. But there we are.
Walter Williams went to South Africa. His Thomas Hall's friend sadly died last year. And in South Africa, under the apartheid system, where the law was not properly enforced, he found that on building sites, construction sites, for instance, blacks were way overrepresented. People were just willingly breaking the law to hire them because it made economic sense to do so. In the supposedly the most racist state supposedly that existed in the world at that time. And actually, if you want to look for examples of entrenched racial discrimination in any government with hiring and firing practices, it's only where government usually takes steps either to enforce it or to enforce its opposite where these things happen. So in the United States, for instance, the last organizations to get on board with desegregation were then government state-owned monopolies like AT&T, which took decades to actually get on board with it and resisted it at every turn. So if he's arguing that there should be no laws saying that for the government to intrude in people's hiring and firing practices on racial grounds, I'm all for that. If he's saying that people should turn down black or Arab candidates because they're black or Arab, I'm not for that. Though I think I am for their right to do so. Though I just disagree with it. Again, though, that's a complex point. It's an academic point which can be debated. It's not on its face obviously toxically far right. We've done women's role should be to have and raise children. He claimed to be on the side of General Bugeaud, who massacred Muslims during the colonization of Algeria. Well, yeah, but his sense of French history would have it that the Algerians weren't very nice back, and there's some evidence for that. That's why there was a long and bloody civil war. Contended that Marshal Pétain saved Jews. I think that's a little bit of a dodgy claim during the Second World War. Would like the death penalty to be reinstated. Lots of people would like that to be reinstated. It consistently polls very highly in every country where it's been banned. If the Guardian wants to dismiss something like 53% of the UK population as far-right, racist, xenophobic bigots, which they probably do because they're the Guardian, they're welcome to do so, but then good luck winning elections. His overarching narrative is reversing France's supposed national decline, which featured again in the video announcing his candidacy
Yeah,
last year.
if I can jump in here, I mean, it's perhaps too large a point to go into in this segment, but this is where I sort of despair at all politicians, left or right, like usually on the right, like Zemmour, uh, who seem to imagine that if only people voted for them and their sort of policies, they could reverse national decline. I just don't see it because I don't I politics is downwind of culture, and the forces that change culture are always hard to put one's finger on, and they are bound up in long swathes of time, and there are all sorts of sort of underground forces at work, and spiritual declines, and shifting zeitgeists, and it's all very sort of mercurial. And I've always doubted, and I doubt now more than ever, the ability of a single politician to reverse what they call national decline. I just don't think it can happen.
No, but there is another string to that bow, though, which, I mean, as the Guardian goes on to say, his rise is reflective of a broader cultural shift toward the right. So it's not
Yeah,
as though
but
he's
it's
come from
I do
nowhere and
see.
said, right, I'm going to single-handedly reverse the decline. No, there's already been an element of culture shift, which is from why he's popular in the first place. And it's
Yeah,
why
but
you get
if
people
you look
around the
at
world,
this,
Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, Erdogan
yeah,
is
but
doing the same
here,
thing, Putin's doing
no,
the same thing. All of these people say, roughly speaking, the same thing. They all appeal to a deep cultural sense that something has gone badly wrong
and I
and it
don't
can be
disparage
fixed.
that, and I agree with that, but it can't be fixed in the sense, Bob can fix it. Yes, he can, kind of a thing. Things can be problems can be assuaged, or even in some rare instances reversed. I don't doubt that, and I don't doubt that Zemmour is doing what Trump is doing, and to some extent what Brexit did. I don't doubt that some wrongs can be put right, not at all. But when when you look at this stuff in the grand historical sweep, and you look at history, and you look at analogous instances of this kind of thing in history, I'm reading at the moment about the fall of the Byzantine Empire, and then you've got all these, you know, uh, I'm reading about periods which historians today describe very clearly and explicitly as being part of the clear decline of this or that empire, in this case the Byzantine Empire. But back in that time, at that time, you have emperors stepping forward saying, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to restore our greatness. I just don't see it. I think a lot of this stuff is completely beyond our control, completely beyond our control. And I think that politicians who step forward and be able to claim to be able to fix things are lying to themselves, not least to anyone else. What they can do is assuage a number of extremely pressing problems. And if they're able to do that, all power to them, and I'd probably vote for them. But the idea that, just on their strength and their election, their rise to power, they can reverse things beyond our control. I think it's foolish and hubristic.
Well, then that's perhaps so, but I think people like Zemmour would argue that they're not trying to control these things. They're trying to create the conditions under which the people, their own culture, can reassert itself.
But therein lies the question: how does a culture do that? Because
Well,
I
we
think
have
cultures have motors, and these things don't just you know y- they don't just create themselves. I mean, these things.
Well, no,
You,
but
you,
that's why they are saying that they are trying to create the conditions for which, under which it can happen. We have some relatively
or
recent
perhaps
examples of
I'm
this.
being overly cynical. I mean,
Well,
I
no, I
tend
mean,
to think that the motor of culture is not religion per se, not institutional religion per se, but some sort of great spiritual upwelling of of confidence, you might say. And it's certainly the view that Kenneth Clark, for instance, gives in the beginning of his Civilization series. And whenever a culture or a civilization loses that sense of spiritual meaning and momentum and vivacity, it flounders and something else comes to replace it. And in a way, Zemmour and people like him aren't wrong, because the thing that's coming in to replace our desuetude is something that has, for most of its history, been quite alien to us, namely Islam. So yeah, I don't disagree with him, and as I say, I mean, I would.
but then that's the removal of one of the principal restraints on a cultural resurgence, which he's arguing. He's said, for instance, in the Spectator interview, that he thought it was embarrassing for France that Britain was sending it money to try and stop the migrants, as though France was some third world country. He said it was a slight against the pride of France that the French were allowing this to happen. Under him, these people would never have made it to Calais, because he's frequently advocated that people should be, essentially, if they cross the French border illegally, they should be turned around and sent away. If they're here illegally and they commit crimes, they should be sent away. If they've recently
Well,
migrated
he's
legally
not
and they commit
wrong.
crimes, they should be sent away.
Yeah.
France, as well, it has to be remembered, has an astonishing problem with Islamization in the banlieue, particularly in inner city France. There are whole suburbs where it's incredibly unsafe to go. Whether the law is broken down, the police are reluctant to go in there. And one of the ways in which you can help reverse a decline is by removing the kind of that cultural nihilism, the one that says that they're happy for anyone to come here and live here, no matter what they think of the place, no matter what their ideals are, no matter what their ideology is or their belief system or their religion, no matter whether they want the furtherance of the country or not. Now, that's not against immigration per se, that's against a particular form of immigration. But the left in particular says any restriction on any kind of migration is ipso facto, by its nature, racist. Well, he's pushing back against that. I don't think that's particularly far right. I think that's that would remove one of the very important constraints, which would enable, potentially, possibly not in actuality, but at least would improve the chance of a kind of cultural resurgence. It's better to have someone there who has a sense of French history and a sense of French culture and the civilizational instinct than it is to have someone like Macron, who affects these things but doesn't understand any of them and has no ideas for how to actually let the people decide for themselves. And I go back then to what I was saying about, okay, it's one thing to say that politicians can't control all of these things and that politics is downwind from culture, but these politicians aren't coming from a vacuum either. These politicians are a result of a cultural shift which is already happening. And to the extent that they remove barriers to enable to the extent they remove the barriers that stop that cultural shift from progressing yet further, I think they're a good thing. And we do have recent examples. I'm with you. Cynicism is always the best default position, because more often than not, you will be right. But we do have recent-ish historical analogies of the kind of mindset that you've adumbrated. If we go back to the 1970s, America, all the intellectuals in America said that effectively the age of American empire, the age of American greatness was gone. You had Arthur Schlesinger saying that, in about 10, 20 years' time, the Soviet Union will be the dominant force in the world forever after. There was a huge sense of declinism abroad in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, especially after Watergate and Vietnam. We had declinism in this country. Britain was the sick man of Europe. We had to join the common market because unless we were tied by chains to the continent, we would be left to drown. This was reversed in relatively short order because actually the people of the country did not agree with the pessimism of their rulers. And all it took was to elect finally leaders who, broadly speaking, agreed with the cultural attitude and mindset of the majority of their people for things to turn around rapidly. So Reagan restores the sense of American self-importance, greatness, its place on the world stage, and wipes the Soviet Union out. Margaret Thatcher does away with this pessimistic idea that Britain is permanently the sick man of Europe, destined always to be a small backwater island begging for handouts from the continent. All of this was done away with because a couple of politicians came around who said, no, I see this groundswell of public support, cultural support in the populace, and I'm going to give voice to this and do what I can to allow this thing to affect the change. Not so much affect the change myself, but allow the culture to affect the change it needs to see. So that would be
Yes, very.
the
Yeah,
up.
that's you convinced me. I agree
I
with
don't think this is
everything.
likely, by the way. I think this is
Oh
still
no,
unlikely.
that's a separate argument. No, you're quite right in everything you've said. I suppose my pessimism doesn't come from our ability to turn this sort of thing around. My pessimism comes from our ability to match what you might call the economic turnaround with a genuine cultural um, uh, well, in the etymological sense of the word renaissance, and that's what I fear we won't be able to do unless we recover something I think we've very much turned our backs on in the West. Um,
I think I'd agree with that. I mean, again, we have also to remember that for all we've been talking about Zemmour, and everyone is talking about him because his rise is improbable, he is still polling 17%, not 50,
yeah,
not 30, 17. That could grow. It probably will grow, but it would be premature to say, well, because of his rise and the rise of people like Donald Trump, for instance. I don't think Donald Trump was a very good vehicle for this, but he was at least better than the opposite. But just because these people are around doesn't necessarily mean that the culture broadly has unified around an alternative vision to the declinist one of our present rulers.
yeah. Well, I suppose the thing I'm trying to hit at is that it's possible to be economically successful while being culturally nihilistic to some extent. And I'd also point out, not point out, I'd like to stress that when I speak of spiritual rejuvenation, I don't mean the revival of Christendom, which to put it bluntly, because that I think is a lot of what you sort of right wing punditry, particularly
Oh yeah, that really tedious. Oh, the new
yeah,
atheists are
sort of
wrong. We regret the decline of Christianity.
it
Christianity would save us.
it's your classic sort of right wing, mostly Catholic, sort of integralist position, which is the kind of position.
Slightly camp social conservatism.
Yeah, it's the kind of position advocated by that chap, Sohrab Ahmari in America.
Oh God.
If only we could become sort of institutionally, that is, governmentally, religious or Catholic or Christian, we could rejuvenate Christendom and everything would be better again. But of course, the irony is, and this is becoming increasingly clear to me, the deeper I learn about Eastern Orthodoxy. Um, the irony is that that is quite a specifically Catholic mindset. Um, I think if you take this is my opinion now. If you take the gospel seriously as a Christian, you really take that seriously, and you look at what Christ is supposed to mean for Christians and to be, um, then the support of a sort of institutionalized and revived nativistic belligerent Christendom is actually tantamount to heresy, to be honest with you. I think it's a good thing if Christians are spiritually, not politically or socially perhaps, but spiritually, it's probably a good thing that Christians are being pushed back into the social catacombs, because at least then, um, as Rod Dreher argues, for instance, in the Benedict option, we might there recover something of the real bread and meat, of what it means to live that kind of life. So that's the kind of spiritual rejuvenation I'm talking about, and it needn't be Christian, but it does, I think, require the recovery of a way of looking at the world, a way that infuses it with meaning. And this is a Scrutonian way. Roger Scruton was never, he never subscribed to institutional Christianity, but he always had a soft spot for it, because I think he understood that it's captured something. It captured a sort of grammar about the way that we might look at the world as a sort of a transcendental plane in which certain things really were sacred, really were beautiful, really were significant. And I think that it doesn't matter how economically successful we become, unless we recover that way of looking at the world. And it's not peculiar to Christianity or indeed Judaism or Islam. It's inherent to every religion, I would say, including the paganisms of antiquity. Unless we can recover something of that transcendental way of looking at the world, it doesn't matter how rich we become.
Yeah, I mean, we could go on about this at length. I disagree
Sorry.
only insofar as you can look to a huge number of countries in the world which have never lost that spiritual dimension, and you wouldn't want to live in any of them. And they are incredibly poor and unhappy, despite having the spiritual dimension. It's not sufficient. The response to the religious right is an attempt to canalize the river of culture in a response to the left canalizing the river of culture. It's an equivalent attempt at grasping attempt at control over a thing that should not be controlled. If you want a culture to have a
Indeed,
sense
it
of
shouldn't be
itself, whether it's spiritual or otherwise, I don't care what the culture says about itself. It should be for the culture, broadly speaking, to define it. The mass of the people should define their own belief systems, their own values. They should be left alone to do that. And the only reason they can't do that, which is the reason that we have fragmented, is precisely because of these kinds of efforts at control. From the left, we get the sense, the idea that we can import people willy-nilly in hundreds of thousands a year into small islands, and this will have no effect at all on culture, which is a form of illiberal imposition because nobody was ever asked about this. And from the right, you get the equivalent argument from Sohrab Ahmari that we should do none of this, and instead we should all read from his good book.
And
Sohrab Ahmari is a really good vision of the decline, potential other flavor of the decline of Western civilization.
No, completely. And what you're describing very well is the fragmentation that you avert to. I mean, if you look at the etymology of religion, because what religion is like, it's like the word politics. I mean, it's so easy to sort of misuse, but in its most basic etymological sense, religiare from the Latin, it just means to bind. And this is why I don't think you need to be religious in the institutional sense, or indeed Christian, to get the point I'm trying to make, which is that in order for a culture to thrive, there needs to be that religiare. There needs to be, I mean, I would go one step further and say that it probably helps to have some sort of general metaphysical consensus about where we are and what we're doing. But you might not even need that, but you do need.
People don't give a damn about metaphysics.
No,
People give a damn about inflation.
No, most people never have. I agree with you, but they've never really needed to, because that's the stuff of theology. What is theologically held filters down into the folk beliefs of ordinary people, if you see what I mean.
I think
But
theology is downstream from culture, just as politics is.
well, theology
Theology
also helps create culture.
No, culture precedes religion. That's a debate for another time, but it is, historically tenable as a suggestion. There have been studies that show it. You have examples from ancient history of
I could point to a
decentralized.
number of examples that say that religion precedes culture.
Yes, but I only need one.
I only need one.
No, you don't, because for your claim to hold, it needs to be true everywhere. For my claim to hold, there needs to be one exception to your rule. If there is one exception to your rule
Well,
is not a rule.
couldn't we both be right and wrong in different instances?
No, because if you say that it must precede culture,
well, then I'll amend my. well,
if you
okay.
say that
Let's meet.
that's a different claim.
But okay. Well, I stated it too, absolutely, perhaps. But surely we would both agree that religion has some influence on culture. But all I'm trying to say is that we need a religiare. We need a binding. We need something that brings us together in a common vision of who we are and where we're going. To put it at its most basic and mild.
No, you're a systemic
No,
thinker.
because no, it's nothing. You don't need to be a systematizer to believe that, because in the absence of that, what we have is exactly the kind of fragmentation that you are describing. I mean,
No,
why do you
we've had
think?
too much of that. We've had what we have is
Why
that
why
kind
is
of
it? Why
thought,
is
but
it? Do
from a
you think?
political position which you don't agree with. The
Why
left
is?
has this kind of theology. The left has this theodicy, The left has this guiding methodology. That's the one we've been living under.
Yes,
It's
and
not the
I'm
want
asking
of
you,
that that
I'm
we're
asking you the
understanding.
more basic question of why is it, do you think, that these various fresh ideological forces have been so successful? It's because of a vacuum was left in the wake of the decline of Christianity, and that surely tells you something about how these things function.
No, it's because people elected left-wing governments.
But you admit yourself that politics is downstream of culture, so it can't just be that.
No, because they're elected under false pretenses. So, for instance, if you go to immigration is one of the
So
most socially.
elections are
No, if
responsible for
I'll
all of
finish
it.
the sentence, it might make sense. So Tony Blair, immigration is one of the most cultural mass immigration, uncontrolled mass immigration is the most probably the single most culturally destructive force on the planet. Which again, because we have to keep pointing this out, is not to say immigration per se; it's to say uncontrolled mass immigration. So an abandonment of any idea or philosophy of melting pot, for instance, in favor of multiculturalism, incredibly destructive. Tony Blair never promised this when he was running for office. He promised people more social spending. He promised people a break from Tory sleaze. He promised to bring Britain into the 21st century. A fresh face, fresh ideas. That's what he promised people. He didn't say, and I will let in uncontrolled millions of people every year and destroy what you think of as your cultural self. So this was not culture produced. This was not politics reacting to culture. This was politicians getting in under false
Well,
pretenses
you said
and doing
yourself
things they
earlier in the
never said that they would
conversation
do.
that politicians aren't themselves created in a vacuum. You said it in the context of Zemmour. You said of
No,
people
but
like
Lenin
Zemmour.
Lenin never had majority support in Russia.
No, no,
Hitler
no.
never had
Hang on. I will.
majority
No,
support in Germany.
I will finish this sentence. You said you said of Zemmour and people like him that the reason that they are rising to prominence is that the culture has some need of them. And I would argue the same thing about people like Tony Blair. Tony Blair's policy of migration, however he couched it, would have been unthinkable in the Victorian era, precisely because the culture and the people that culture produced, who went into politics and had these opinions and fitted into that zeitgeist, would not have countenanced them.
No, you absolutely would, because you always have social radicals. You always have people like H.G. Wells who would absolutely go in for that kind of thing. Open borders and eugenics, really good combination of stuff.
Yeah, but all the people you're mentioning, I mean, I'm trying to take a sort of a long view here, which is probably not to my not not working for me. But all of the people you mentioned, H.G. Wells, for instance, I mean, all of these people are coming after the desuetude that Matthew Arnold is describing on Dover
But
Beach.
the point is, they never had majority support. These are not products of the general decline of culture, because there are always gadflies, there are always heretics. Even under the most totalitarian religious system or the most culturally unified system, there are always heretical thinkers. These are in some way a product of culture, only in the sense that everything in some degree breeds its opposite. But these people never have majority support. They never have the support of the masses. They're never particularly popular. Their ideas are never popular. They never usually win elections by telling the truth. They lie to get in. And this is not a result of the decline of culture. This is a result of people getting in under false pretenses and the people, generally speaking, giving government too much power.
But
And
that word
that's an element of
culture, I
cultural
mean,
slip. But
it's thrown about all the time. Culture, 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 and we're both guilty of it. I suppose all I'm saying is, and I know you disagree with me, and that's fine, but from where I'm coming from, I simply have a hard time conceiving of how a healthy culture, whatever we take that word to mean, can actually emerge and flourish without that underlying religiare, without that underlying spiritual
but
element.
again,
And
you're a systemic
I
thinker.
would challenge you. Well,
You have this
not
the wrong way
in this
about.
instance. In this instance, I don't need to be, and I would ask you. I would challenge you to name a single culture in history that was not in large part motored and animated by a metaphysical or religious dispensation of some sort, a vision of the transcendent. I'd just name one.
But again, there are examples. I can't reel them off the top of my head. I'd have to go and find the study again, but it was out of Oxford University that showed pretty definitively that culture precedes religion.
Well,
So
I'd like
there
to
is that.
look at that. Well, it's a pretty
I will
blanket
find
statement.
it and send it. I'll have to.
If
Can I
you
find it
object to the
now?
blanket statement, all culture is preceded by religion, I would object to equally to the blanket statement of Oxford University, of which I
But
am
no,
generally
because
skeptical
no,
these days
you're
anyway.
not making the equivalent claim. You're saying if you're saying that
I'm not making that
religion,
claim
no,
anymore.
okay, but you're saying that my claim is that claim, which it isn't. I'm not saying that culture must precede religion. I'm simply saying that it can and has and therefore does.
but what that would require you to find me is effectively a non-religious culture in history. That's effectively what that would entail, a non-religious culture in history, one that isn't even animated by the most basic animistic religion, just
No,
completely non-religious.
this goes back to what
No
I was
transcendent
attempting
vision
to
of the world.
say. Goes back to what I was attempting to say, which is that you're a systemic thinker in the sense that you impose these systems from the top down. You assume that there must be unifying vision first, culture second. I'm saying if you get out of the way of culture, culture will produce the unifying vision.
But surely we're both committing a rather evident fallacy here in ignoring the fact that this is an inherently symbiotic relationship. I mean, it
What
would have to be, given what we've both claimed. And I think most of the evidence does support that. It is a very much symbiotic relationship, culture and religion. Because you're quite right. I mean, I don't want to be. I am often prone to this fault. I'll grant you that of top-down systematic thinking. But there are obviously, you're quite right, numerous instances in history of sort of cultures forming from the sort of effluent, the effluence or whatever the word is, the baggage of leftover non-systematic metaphysical ways of thinking. You know, non-systematic, non-institutional religions. I mean, Zoroastrianism had its effect on I think late Judaism and early Christianity, and you've got the Hellenic influence in there. I mean, it's never an entirely top-down, you know, tick all the boxes, bang, and the culture is born. It's never like that. It's symbiotic.
It is symbiotic, but again, one takes primacy over the other. My claim is not necessarily that is not symbiotic. It's simply that in which direction does the symbiosis work?
Yeah,
Does the
you're
unifying
being
vision precede the culture, or does it not? I'm saying get out of the way of culture. Culture will decide for itself what unifies it.
yeah. Well, we're obviously ignoring the elephant in the room, to use the cliche again, of what culture is. I mean, we're obviously ignoring the manifold sort of biological needs that give rise to a lot of cultural practices and just brute needs of survival. But no, it seems to me perfectly symbiotic. I think you're being a bit Rousseauian about it. I mean, again, if you think that culture definitely does have primacy, it would seem to me that you are sort of you're rather forced into looking for some sort of weird state of nature culture before religion. Because if you grant that that's not the case, then you'd have to concede that the culture you're talking about was indeed influenced by prior religious impulses at the very least.
No, why?
Because otherwise you'd be forced to admit that you're looking for a culture that has it sort of precedes all religion.
Those things do exist, as I've said.
I literally can't conceive of how that would be the case, given that our earliest knowledge of human beings, you know, the first prehistoric human beings, we can be pretty sure had religious impulses and
Oh
had
no, no,
trans.
no. Only if no. If you're no, if you're taking, for instance, ritualistic practices and saying, ergo, it must be religious, then that's simply untrue. Birds hold funerals
Oh,
for each
but
other. Are
but I'm
birds
not.
also religions?
Oh no, no. But well, hang on. Um,
Found it.
Moralizing gods appear after, not before, the rise of social complexity, new research suggests. The idea of morally concerned gods is by no means universal, while in many small scale societies the ancestors and deities may demand continual rites and sacrifices to please and appease them, they may be quite unconcerned with how people treat each other. Yeah, well, it would appear then that we've been laboring under a misunderstanding, because this is quite obviously, even from the headline and the nib there at the top, talking about monotheistic gods, moralizing gods, or gods that concern themselves in human affairs.
Religious
Whereas,
gods as opposed to a religious gods.
no, 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 this is not. This clearly isn't claiming that there are societies out there who had no conception whatsoever
Is the
of.
ancient Greek pantheon of highly specific household gods religious?
Yes.
But if the god only exists in a household, the household is the religion?
Wait, what?
Well, the Greeks and in the early stages the Romans had a general pantheon, and they also had very specific household gods,
Yeah,
localized household gods.
yeah.
People in Epirus would not be worshipping the same gods as the people in Athens, despite both being nominally Greek. In what sense is this religious without turning the word religion into something so broad as to be practically meaningless?
Well, this is what I've been saying all along. I said quite early, I was distancing myself from the notion that we have developed of religion, the way that most people use religion today, but it's not the only use of the word by any means, is a very recognizable institution such as the Catholic Church, which has rules and dogmas and is highly organized, etc., and so forth. I've been trying to use religion in the religiare sense of the basic human impulse to believe in some sort of transcendent realm populated by divine beings, who have some sort of role to play in the unfolding of the universe. And that seems to me a ubiquitous and historically universal impulse. And I don't think that's to debase the word religion to be completely meaningless at all.
No, it is, because you're using the word religion to encompass a huge number of social arrangements or ritualistic
Yeah, but
arrangements or cultural arrangements.
there's a reason I've done that, because my meta argument, if you will, was that my, my original argument was that I find it very difficult to imagine um, Western cultures being able to rejuvenate themselves without some religious impulse. And I was using the example of pretty much all past human beings as an example of how we don't really know of any cultures that have not had that impulse and
No,
that
we do. We
religiare.
do. The stuff that research suggests that the religious impulse metastasizes into religion after you've developed some kind of socially cohesive culture, not before. Before
Um,
before the Greek states became a sort of unified cultural entity, they all came with different ritualistic practices and some different religious practices, and the unification happened before the cultural unification of their religious ideals. Same thing with the Roman Empire, before the centralization of the religious impulse in the form of an institution. These things do predate religion, and cultures do grow, tends to be alongside, going back to the symbiotic argument, tends to be alongside the growth of the religion. But it's not the case that religion must always, or indeed necessarily, has to predate the culture. It's not a religious convergence that leads to the convergence of the Greek states as a political unit, for instance.
yeah,
It's
no,
not a religious. I mean, the
I
Macedonians who
I think I
ruled the
agree with you.
Greeks in the Hellenistic period worshipped incredibly different gods to the rest of mainland Greece. They were always looked down upon for that.
Yeah,
But
no, no, complete. No, I agree. I agree with you. If you're simply saying that you can find cultures and you can point to cultures that have no particularly organized and instantiated and recognizable and dogmatic religion preceding them, then that gave rise to them. Then yeah, completely. But I would want to, yeah, stress the symbiotic nature of that relationship.
But that is
Um,
sufficient then for my claim, which is that if you primarily get maleficent actors out of the way, if you say stop electing politicians who lie to you and who enact policies that they never told you they would enact, if you get these people out of the way and you remove the cultural impositions that they have forced upon you, then politics being out of the way, culture will decide for itself, and you might then see a return to a broader form of religiosity,
and
of
that's
one
my
form or
that's
another.
yeah.
But that
So
is very
I'm
much the
putting
resurgence of religion relying upon the freeing of the culture preceding it.
Yeah, yeah, but that's where I'm putting the difference of emphasis here. You say get politics out of the way, culture will do its own thing, but you conveniently leave out what that would mean in practice.
No, no, because that's
You give
supererogatory.
culture,
That's not. It's not a
you
part of my
sort of
argument.
you sort of almost anthropomorphize culture and give it this sort of agency to do what it will. And I'm saying
What it will
it's all
might
very
involve
well
a religious impulse.
it's all very well to say here's a thing called culture, but I'm trying to ask, okay, supposing you have got politics, as it were, out of the way, and the cultural sphere is left more unfettered, what what of necessity would be the thing driving that? Because culture is related to religion. It's
People's ordinary day-to-day human small-scale social interactions where people naturally form groups with people who are of like minds, They get together in institutions, in clubs. They discuss things. They share ideas. It's not a again. It's
Yeah,
not a
but
systematized thing. If
that's
you
all
get out
very
of the way, and
milquetoast.
it's
That's
not
all
milk
very
toast.
it's
It's
milquetoast
the
because
most
when you look
profound
into
thing about the
history,
human species.
no, it is milquetoast because when you look back into human history and you say, okay, describe 17th century Japanese culture, describe Viking culture, describe Saxon culture. What most people take that request to mean is describe the net sum of not just practices and interactions, but beliefs animating and giving the spirit, as it were, to that people, to that culture. It's very easy to describe Viking culture. It comes with a certain set of beliefs, um, and I agree. It wasn't necessarily preceded by any very exact doctrinal formulation of anything. I mean, we only really see that with the rise of the monotheistic religions, anyway. But nevertheless, when people say, "What is the culture of this? What is Viking culture, etc.?" It's fairly obvious what that question is asking.
But you're changing the question. The question is not what does this culture look like. The question is how is this culture formed? As in what sense
And
do what
all
does the
I'm
cultural reaction
stressing,
consist of?
all I'm
I
stressing
could
is that in
describe for
most
you Viking
all
society if you
I'm
want to, but
stressing
that's beside the point.
all I'm stressing is that in pretty much every historical instance I've ever come across, one of the components, indeed, I would say a very important component of the thing that makes up that culture, not the only one, but a very important one, and one that has a symbiotic relationship to all the other things, is the shared beliefs of that culture about their place in the
Yes,
universe.
which is why I'm trying to adumbrate the context, the circumstances which must come to be for such arrangements to arise in the first place.
Well,
You're making a sub argument. You're making
a
a
sub
development.
argument.
No, you're making a development of the point I'm trying to make,
I
not
presume by
countering the
sub you
point
don't
I'm
mean
making.
subpar.
Well, only in the sense that it misses the point.
I would like to point out that there is some quite famous evidence in my favor of the discoveries in, when was it? I think the 1970s, was it? Where are we? It's called Göbekli Tepe, it's archaeological discovery in Turkey. They found a whole bunch of stuff that dated to 9,500 BC, but megaliths, big temples, things like this. Um, when was it discovered? Uh, bum, bum, bum. Oh, it doesn't say, but it's sort of when it was discovered beforehand, the general assumption had been in this field and in the fields of anthropology and sociology and so on. The general assumption had been that religious considerations were always secondary to sort of agricultural considerations, for example. So once you've established fields and you've got things to eat,
They do tend to
then
attack each other quite well.
then you build the temples. But this site in Turkey, Göbekli Tepe, I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly. Um, Richard Dawson, actually, the 20th century Catholic historian, describes it as being quite significant because um, there were there were no. I'm not going to do it justice, but you should, listeners and you, if you want to, you look into the various interpretations because there are many. I'm not saying this is the only interpretation of it, but there are a number of interpretations erected around this discovery and its significance. And one of the ones that gained a lot of momentum because it seemed to warrant it was that the fact that there were no agricultural sites within miles and miles and miles of this place is that this thing took precedence over the subsequent, day-to-day living that rose up around it. That this thing was built primarily and exclusively for its religious significance, and that everything else paled into, that the agriculture was secondary, if you will.
Oh, come on. There's an infinite, sorry, number of potential explanations
Oh
as
no,
to
you
how
can
that
stick
thing
with
can come to be.
infinitesimal.
No, there are so many permutations of that as the reasons that could come to be. Like, for instance, if it's built by a culture other than the one in whose land it's located, then it will reflect the religious practices of the culture that built it, not necessarily of the locals who live there. That's one. It can account for changes of geography. Land which is no longer arable might once have been arable in the past. So a farming god might exist in a place where there are no farms. These things, that requires a huge amount more of specific qualification before it becomes tenable as an argument, because there are so
That
many
is true. Yeah,
plausible
that's fair
alternatives.
enough. If I
Otherwise,
may,
the general practice is for religious rituals to evolve alongside and reflect the nature of the place in which they are. So agrarian cultures do tend to have more agrarian rituals, for instance. Cultures in dire need of water have more rain dances than we do in this island, for instance. The Japanese mythology is much more based around the sea than the mythology of Sudan is, for instance. I could go on.
well, just in the interest of fairness, the paragraph of the Wikipedia page of this site, Göbekli Tepe, um, it just says quickly, Göbekli Tepe is regarded by some as an archaeological discovery of great importance, since it could profoundly change the understanding of a crucial stage in the development of human society. Some researchers believe that the construction of Göbekli Tepe may have contributed to the later development of urban civilization, or as excavator Klaus Schmidt put it, first came the temple, then the city. And I suppose to me that's demonstrative of the fact that um, in Athens or take Rome for example. I mean, the true origins of Rome can be described in a number of what you might call materialistic ways, and they're not to be disparaged because they're the most useful ones for historians. But it's very significant, isn't it, that Rome always saw itself as having been born from Romulus and Remus. In other words, a myth, a transcendent story that gave Rome its spirit and its raison d'être. And that's the kind of thing I'm averring to. I'm not claiming anything quite so radical as I claimed at the beginning. I think you've certainly changed my mind on a number of things. But all I'm saying is, if you look at the significance that that myth of Romulus and Remus had to the life of Rome, that's sort of what I'm getting at here. It's impossible, to my mind, to create a thriving civilization or culture, because I think there is probably a distinction. Kenneth Clark said, for instance, that the Vikings had a culture but couldn't be said to have a civilization, which I think is interesting. But nevertheless, I think it avers to the fact, the observable fact, that in all of these great and thriving cultures and civilizations, you tend to see, and you almost invariably see, some animating mythos, some transcendent belief behind it. And all I'm doing when I say that I'm being cynical about our ability to do the same is that, having as a society abandoned Christianity, um, and again, I don't think you need to be a Christian to sort of see this point, I'm doubtful as to what we might replace it with, other than what you've described earlier, which is this endlessly proliferating fragmentation of ideologies.
No, but again, if you leave it to its own devices, that endlessly proliferating fragmentation of ideologies could begin to congeal again, because you've stopped importing countercultural
Yeah,
ideologies and belief systems. I mean, on
destructive.
the Rome point, I mean, Rome famously wasn't built in a day. It didn't emerge in a vacuum. There are animating reasons behind that particular creation myth being the one that was chosen. In the same way, you can say, I mean, Hilaire Belloc was relatively astute for him when he pointed out that Islam is basically a Christian heresy because it comes from a Christian context. Most of its fundamental ideals are plays on Christian ideas in the Bible. A lot of the Quran is lifted straight from the Bible. The corollary of that point would be that the Prophet Muhammad would not have emerged in China. Um, so
Mm.
my point is that there are antecedent historical conditions which flavor and give rise to subsequent unifying religions, but the antecedent conditions are by definition antecedent. So it's those that I'm interested in. In what contexts do these creation myths arise? In what contexts do unifying religious ideologies and belief systems arise? What is necessary for that to happen in the first place? Rather than starting with those as though that was the starting point of all culture. It's not. No culture emerges in a vacuum.
Quite right. Two things on that point. First, I agree with you that these things ought to be left to congeal, and you know, well, an observation, if I may. I mean, the Romulus and Remus myth. I think you used the word chosen. We don't know when that was chosen. I would say it probably wasn't chosen. It could have been. There could have been.
Analogously chosen. I mean, I didn't mean
Yeah,
I didn't mean that
I
people got around and said, right, of all these ones we've got on offer, we pick those. I don't. That's
yeah,
not what
yeah.
I meant.
It itself was probably just a sort of slow, sort of accretion that just solidified. But one thing that does slightly, I think, put the spanner in the works of the both of us is that in a lot of the societies we're describing, particularly Rome, things very much were not allowed to be left to their own devices in the kind of liberal free market way that we would describe Western, present day contexts in.
I
Um,
disagree. State capacity in the Roman Empire was much, much smaller than the state capacity in the modern ages, largely for economic and technological reasons.
um, Relatively or absolutely, because the emperor was the emperor, and he did decree a lot of things. I say he, any number of them.
Well,
I mean,
as a thought experiment, could the emperor in Rome exercise as much direct, immediate control via policy or any other instrument over a Roman territory in Britain or Israel as Xi Jinping can in Xinjiang province in China today?
okay, I don't want to sound Weasley by reframing the question
Hmm.
because I see where you're going with it, and
Bad form to
I,
dispute an
I don't,
hypothetical.
I don't disagree with you, but there is certainly an analogy there, though, surely, because you've got, just to take the obvious example, Constantine the Great, or Constantine, however you pronounce it, decreeing this is the religion now, and within 300 years, um, everyone's Christian. The broadest reaches of the empire were more or less. Uh, so they did have a lot of power to
No,
decree
they
things.
did, but my point is significantly less than we have today. There is less capacity for control, largely because it takes months for an edict to get from Rome
Yeah,
to
that's true.
Israel, for
Yeah,
instance. It's very
or years.
it's why Roman government, in a sense, there was more decentralization in Rome because there was a lot more power instantiated in local governors by necessity, because they had to handle the day-to-day running of things, because you couldn't do it from the central heart of the empire. The empire would set policies, which would then filter down to the local governors. But in the interim, the local governors would be in charge of their provinces. The Greeks had much the same thing. Alexander the Great's great failing as a leader was that he didn't really pay much attention to all this stuff. So had no competent governors allied to his guiding mythos, shall we say, to take over from him after he died, and they all fell apart warring with each other.
Well,
But it
doesn't
took such
he
a
doesn't
long,
he
long
rather
time.
scupper your claim as well, though? I mean, Hellenism is only a thing because Alexander the Great went about the ecumeny imposing it, more
No,
or less.
Hellenism long predated Alexander. And Alexander was trying to revive Hellenism precisely because it had already died.
No,
And
no,
the
no, 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 no.
The Hellenistic period, which is Alexander's period, didn't last very long because the moment he died, also he didn't pay much attention to the religious lives of the people he conquered. He famously took wives from people in Persia, for instance, but left them to their own devices. He didn't intervene in their religious affairs. He didn't intervene very much in their cultural affairs. So he didn't really go around converting people to the Hellenistic ideal, which would be my point. I think it's not, it's
Yeah,
simply
but
not comparable with the
had he
ability of
not
modern states to exercise control over individuals is much greater, and that's why we have much bigger governments which spend much more money, despite having much cheaper means of exercising control,
I completely agree
on
with you
exercising
about the
control of people.
extent of modern politicians' control. But again, I just would point out that, it's I think itself a myth to imagine that any culture really has evolved, on its own steam, as it were. I mean, there've always been top-down powers who have pushed things along or dragged it backwards or whatever. Then again, Justinian tried to repaganize Rome, and he wasn't very successful. His probably fictional dying words were, "Pale Galilean, thou hast conquered," in reference to Jesus. He realized on his deathbed, so the saying goes, that no matter what effort he put into the repaganization of the Roman Empire, the battle was lost at that point.
Yeah, but I think that goes back to a variant of my meta point, which is that one of the reasons religions die, the reason empires die, is that the culture of their territories moves on without them, to the point where they're no longer able to
Mm.
exercise their will and their writ over it.
And I'd
It's
also
gone because
point out,
the culture
um,
is what creates. Culture is what creates, and people arise later to try and control it via centralized religious institutions, for instance. But
yeah,
they'll never outlast a broader cultural shift away from them, which is why it's important to understand the reasons why certain cultures emerge, and what historical conditions they emerge, and what belief systems they then produce, rather than say, well, if we could only superimpose a different unifying belief system now, that would solve all cultural problems. So again, it's the difference between a bottom-up understanding of this and a ground-up one.
Well, again,
top down thing.
I'd stress the symbiotic stuff again,
Yeah.
and you're right. Cultures and
I
empires,
think we can end the show
obviously.
right there.
Well, one more
Oh
observation.
no, you said I'm right. That's good. That's
Oh,
no, one more observation.
yeah, which is that if it is symbiotic, which it would appear to be, um, I would simply point out that one of the components to the rise and, well, the declines of these, for the cultures and civilizations, one of the components, because you can point the obvious materialistic ones, economies, for example, economics is hugely important to these things. Um, Much more important than most people give them credit for. But nevertheless, I think spiritual anime is a component, and I think, yeah,
Yeah,
that tends to be what I stress, but probably the lady doth protest too much.
but you can't shape the metal until you've heated the damn thing. So religion in this context is the hammer, but I'm interested in what creates the heat that melts the metal in the first place to make it pliable.
Well,
Religion can come along and shape things, but something has to happen. There has to be some chemical reaction before that that makes the
I'd
thing
point
shapeable in
out
the first
that
place.
God creates the
Oh god.
universe in which the metal exists. So
Yeah, I'm not getting into that one. I think that brings us to the end.
yes.